I'm going to talk about the forensic strategies against the traumatic conditions of culture, analyzing a couple of artists in 3 moments of recent Brazilian history. It's a part of a larger research of mine in the aesthetic features concerning violence in Brazil. It is not difficult to agree that there's a taboo associated with images of the dead. Even so, the final visible destiny of the dead is often an image, a portrait, a photograph, testifying to the life of someone who is no longer among us, or else serving as a document that shows the circumstances of the person's death. Susan Sontag points out in Regarding the Pain of Others that in the photographs of victims of the violence of war, a frequent subject for media reporters, the taboo manifests itself in the refusal to show the dead person's face, possibly due to a certain modesty in front of the most explicit expression of suffering, or to respect a certain privacy that should be preserved at this final moment. Nonetheless, she goes on to observe that this is a privilege lost with geographical and social distance and is practically non-existent when the material published, frontal views of victims of far-off exotic lands afflicted by the natural disasters of the Third World, or extreme poverty, even when the situation is what prevails in the backyard of our big cities. Publishing the photograph of dead body is still controversial, although this polemic is culturally different when it involves considerations politically motivated. A clear example of this is the invisibility during military regimes of victims of repression and extermination, except in cases where exposing the dead bodies of the enemies of the regime serves the purpose of demoralizing the resistance, showing proof of the real extermination of certain enemies of the regime, such as the photograph of the corpse of the guerrilla fighter Carlos Marighella, who was killed in the 70s, or else to present false evidence of the accidental death of a person detained by the forces of repression, as in the case of the journalist Vladimir Herzog. You can see on your left the photo published by then, and on the right, the real cutting of the photo. In Brazil, the ambivalence between concealing and exposing death was a feature in the 1960s and 1970s. The approach taken by the supposedly serious press addressed to the middle class was quite different from that of the newspapers that circulated among the poorer classes. In the former, censorship hid the cruelty of a historic situation that was increasingly determined by social and political violence, whereas in the latter, death in itself became an explicit attraction, translated in the publication of photographs of scenes of death, at times without any plausible or justified explanatory context. The value of such images that filled newspapers such as O Povo and O Dia was the shock effect that spared the public no detail. These images were often the result of a routine practice where newspaper editors would send photographers to accompany the public service that collected corpses, a sinister garbage drum-cup hearse nicknamed Rabecão, which took the cadavers straight to the morgue in cases where there were no sense in calling an ambulance and no need for any further police or medical procedure. In the newspaper offices, these photographs, often of people unknown and always from poor neighborhoods or slums, were exposed with short, explanatory texts without any connections to the real facts, or else repeating the rumors and common knowledge that the reporters gathered in the region. Most of the stories involved cases of jealousy, vengeance, and crime that mirrored the reality of the increasing violence responsible for the living conditions of a large part of the population of the big cities across the country. In other cases, it was clear that the reasons behind the crimes were political. The so-called death squad, the most notorious of which included the detective Mariel Marisco, one of the famous 12 Rio Gold policemen, were spread all over Brazil, especially in the 1960s and the 1980s. These death squads made Rio de Janeiro neighborhoods, such as Duque de Caxias and Belfort Roxo, the most violent areas in the world, with death statistics equivalent to or higher than areas where war was being waged at that time. For the residents of these regions and the inhabitants of the city in general, this reality was patent in the large number of bodies of unidentified people abandoned in more or less public places, deaths that never received the last attention from the police, especially if the victims were young, black, poor males. Between 1983 and 1995, the homicide rate rose 288% in Rio de Janeiro, finally reaching 70.6 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in 1995. Impacted by this stark reality, the artist Rosangel Renaud, who in 1992 was invited to present a work related to the International Earth Summit, the so-called ECHO 92, created the project Atentado ao Poder via Crucis, an assault against power via Crucis, a series of 15 panels with 13 photographs of men murdered during the months leading up to the summit. The photographs were taken for the illustrations published in two popular newspapers of the time described above, O Povo na Rua and A Notícia. The artist resembled the enlarged photographs in a series that starts and ends in two black panels. They are lit from behind by a phosphorescent light that lets a green halo emerge from between the panels. All the photographs are mounted standing, with the dead bodies positioned vertically, thus creating a phantasmagoric image of a macabre ballet of stiff, frozen dancers. The rustic quality of the reproductions accentuates that these were certainly made from newspaper photographs, copied, underexposed, to provoke the frightening effect of such a sordid display of violent death. All the images register the suffering of extreme violence. The eye of the photographer is there to reveal this moment of agony. I will spare you the close-ups and leave it as a sort of sinister message to the spectator. It is easy for the spectator to draw the conclusion that all the victims were probably accomplices of or in connivance with the same violence that eventually was their fate. All of them are men, poor, and the likelihood dwellers of slum, of the city outskirts, a place where you are born a victim and where crime prevails, even for those who do not corroborate directly with it. Why were they murdered? We do not know, of course. Maybe they were guilty of some crime in the community and duly executed according to the law of retaliation. Perhaps they were killed by rival criminals, or possibly by policemen operating outside the law. They might even only have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Brazilians, whatever the reason, their life was conditioned by violence. And for a young Brazilian male from this social sector, homicide is still the most likely statistical cause of death. The focus used by the artist stresses the frightful aspect of exposed death, the shock provoked in encountering the direct vision of the trauma. Let us compare this with an earlier example of a work created by the neoconcretista artist Hélio Oiticica in 1966. In the Boliges series, Boliges significa fireballs, of intervention works, also called his trance objects. In the 60s, Oiticica frequented the hillside shantytown of Mangueira, a historical place for samba and the Rio Carnival, where he befriended Manuel Moreira, a marijuana dealer from the nearby favela Esqueleto. Anybody who has been visiting Auerge knows that under Auerge, before Auerge was constructed, you had the Esqueleto favela. Moreira was better known as Cara de Cavalo, horseface, and he got himself involved in '64 in an episode that was to mark the history of violence and organized crime in Rio de Janeiro. After killing a detective in a shootout, Cara de Cavalo was hunted down and shot with 52 bullets, 25 of them in his stomach region alone. The policeman covered the body with a skull and crossbones sign, and the incident brought to an end an era of romantic banditry in Rio, and was the kickoff for the famous secret organization Scuderie Lecoq, and the spreading of the death squad throughout the state and the country. Until it lost its prominence in the 90s, during 2 decades of criminal activity, the Scuderie Lecoq was held responsible for at least 30 political murders and an average of some 1,500 assassinations per year. 2 years later, Helio Oiticica created a tribute to his friend Horseface. His Bólige Caixa 18, Poema Caixa 2, Fireball Box 18, Poem Box 2, which contains photograph of the dead bandit executed at the age of 22. Oiticica's work consists in an open box without a lid, containing 4 pictures of the bandit riddled with bullets, prostrate on the ground, with his arms stretched out to form a cross. A transparent veil covered the coffin, and the photographed body. On a sack of pigment in the background was written, "Here he lies, and here he will stay. Contemplate his heroic silence." Oiticica explored in the Bólige series 2 emblematic figures: the anti-hero hero, incarnated in Horseface, and the anonymous anti-hero, exemplified by the bank robber Alcide Figueira da Silva, who committed suicide in 1966 after an abortive hold-up near the Timbo River, where he, rather than be arrested by the police. In Bólige, Caixa 21, B44, the Fireball Box 24, the image of the dead anti-hero appears in a box which, with the bottom showing the inscription, "Why this impossibility?" Later, this photography became famous as used in the poster "Seja Marginal, Seja Herói." The photo was also cut from Jornal do Brasil. Much has been said about the romantic view expressed by Oiticica as regards to criminal marginality. Less attention has been paid to the artist's implicit comment on the exploitation of the criminal's death by the public and the media. Oiticica used blow-ups of photographs of the dead reproduced in the newspaper Jornal do Brasil, and his montage of the fireball with Horseface creates a scenographic dissimulation of the brutality of the image, involved in a religious aura of pietas that brings to mind classic paintings such as Manet's The Dead Bullfighter. In this way, distancing himself critically from the flagrant exposition in the press and transferring the images to a symbolic dimension and exploring them through art. How does one explain the prevailing fascination that the image of death has for contemporary art? How does this enable us to understand better the complexity of the image itself? Might artists such as Rudolf Schäfer, André Serrano, Joel Peter Wittkin, and Susan Upton, between others, many others, be looking for a particular effect associated with the nature of image? Maurice Blanchot, for instance, noted that, I quote, "At first sight, the image does not recall a cadaver, but it could be that the strangeness of a cadaver is also the strangeness of the image. The presence," end quote, The presence of death in photography is a common line of reasoning. At the beginning of the book, Camera Lucida, Barthes says that all those photographers who are at work in the world, determined upon the capture of actuality, do not know that they are agents of death. He adds that the intervention of photography should be seen in the context of the death crisis diagnosed in the middle of the 19th century. In a broader perspective, Barthes feels that the anthropological function of the photographic image is to occupy the space of death in modern society. Death thus becomes the idus of the photography, its very essence, an image that produces death while trying to preserve life, in his words. The paradox that exists in the essence of the image between present and past, the living and the dead, is in Barthes' mind accentuated all the more in photography, above all in images of something or someone dead. The photograph of a cadaver, for instance, tends to appear frightfully awful because it underscores the striking indecidibility of a live image of a dead thing. This is the effect that Barthes investigates in his analysis of photography and described as, I'm going to make a couple of quotes here, the result of a perverse confusion between two concepts, the real and the live. By attesting the object has been real, the photograph subreptly induces belief that it is alive because of that delusion which makes us attribute to reality an absolute superior, somehow an eternal value. But by shifting this reality to the past, this has been, the photograph suggests that it is already dead. The living image thus becomes paradoxically the figurative corpse of what has been alive, whatever the object may be, in relation like that between the photograph and its reference. The other quote, it is as if the photograph always carries its referent with it, both affected by the same amorous or funeral immobility. At the very heart of the moving world, they are glued together, limb by limb, like the condemned man and a corpse in a certain tortures. This paradox between life and death, between representation and referent, is what guides Barthes' thinking not only with regard to this anthology of photography, but also his questioning of the resulting affective experience. In dealing with photography, Barthes tries to define a phenomenology committed to feelings, to an irreducible affect or affective intentionality in the photograph, an intention of the object, as he observes. That was immediately permeated with desire, repulsion, nostalgia, euphoria. It is this affective intentionality in the image that is then translated into the two much discussed topics in Barthes' work, the studium and the punctum. It is well known that studium belongs to the domain of historical and political testimony, which is what arouses interests in photographs, how they allow participation in the figures, faces, and gestures. In this way, studium enables one to participate in the intentionality of the photographer, while the punctum seems to describe how the image proper acts, its affective, haptic dimension, perhaps something that can be understood as the intentionality, the desire of the photographic image as object. As explained by Barthes, punctum is chance in photography, not just the contingent aspect of its operation, but rather what intervenes on the spectator as destiny, what distresses, mortifies, and hurts the spectator. We may like photography in terms of studium, Barthes says, but we love the photograph because of punctum. The philosopher Jacques Rancière has argued against this tension between studium and punctum in Barthes' reading of the photographic image, understood as a duality between a hermeneutic approach on one side and an affective potency on the other. Instead, Rancière stresses the real presence of death in the portraits chosen by Barthes to illustrate the punctum effect, as a return of what Rancière would call the ethical regime of the image. Comparing these images to a kind of funerary mask imprinted by the face of the dead, the ethical image regime is a challenge to representation, and at the same time to the high modernist ideology of the autonomy of affects still present in Barthes. It seems, though, to be Judith Butler who presents the most precise understanding of Barthes' idea when she recently argues that the punctum is not only an index on the necessary pastness of photographic content, reflecting the imminence of death in the portraits of dead persons. On the contrary, the punctum is due to the at least double temporality of the photographic portraits, explicitly stressed by Barthes while looking at the portrait of Louis Paine. He is going to die. I read at the same time, this will be, and this has been. I observe this with horror, an anterior future of which death is at stake. By giving me the absolute past of the pose, the photograph tells me death in the future. In this power to evoke a death to come, it is this power to evoke a death to come that makes photography state the innocence, the vulnerability of lives heading towards their own destruction, as observed by Susan Sontag in her famous book on photography. And it is this link between photography and death that haunts all photographs of people. The keywords in Butler's understanding of punctum seem to be contained in Sontag's statement as certain photographs' haunting capacity to make us more innocent and vulnerable to the pain and the death of the other. Butler's reading of Barthes is still recognizing the punctum as an enigmatic effect of the image as object, independent to the photographer's intention and will, and it allows us to return to the idea of the living image, aroused by the question recently formulated by Thomas Mitchell. What does the image want? What is it after? Mitchell points out to an ontology of the image that goes beyond the usual questioning about what the image means and what it does, what power it possesses to affect us emotionally and change our behavior. But can we really consider the image alive, organically and not just socially alive, the depositary of its own desire? Mitchell, of course, uses the concept of image as an organism in a metaphorical sense. This is an analogy with limits, nevertheless. He considers the metaphor inevitable and necessary for us to understand a kind of spirit of power that the image possesses and that makes us relate to it as if it were alive. In other words, for Mitchell, the life of images is a kind of magical spirituality, a homeopathic power to create spectral realities and take on different bodies. This is clear in the distinction Mitchell makes between image and picture, where picture characterizes the material medium that enables the image to take shape, while image is image in a broader sense, not concerned with the frontiers between the arts. I propose that this double perspective be understood not only as a simple question of adaptation, whereby the same image is capable of being embodied into different materialities and media. According to Marie-José Monsin, we need to understand that image is different from mere visibility, what she calls imagerie. Monsin defines image in the singular as, I quote, what is inscribed in visibility without being visible. In this sense, image is linked to desire to see, whereas visibility is concealing the object of desire. There's no image without the desire to see, even if the object of this desire is nothing more than just looking, she says. In this definition, Monsin refers to Lacan's distinction between the eye and the gaze, where the latter is understood as the capacity of the image to question the spectator, divided as he is between seeing and not seeing. When the spectator removes his sight from the figurative motive, the two ambassadors in Holbein's painting, for instance, a mysterious object represented in anamorphosis of a peripheral and abysmal perspective is recognized sensitively as death itself. The invisible, that is, the image in the singular, is to be understood, following Montaigne, as the sensitive vocation that sustains, orientates, and deviates vision in that fold where the spectator sees and where he or she is always already seen. The gaze seems to emerge from the painting by affectedly attracting the eye and interrupting its figurative stability. Based on a much later series of José Reynaud entitled Apagamentos, Erasures, exhibited for the first time in the Christina Guerra Contemporary Art Gallery here in Lisbon in 2005, we perceive a new function for the cadaver in contemporary images. The work consists of using photographs taken by coroners, the forensic police, and reworked by the artist by means of trimming, sequencing, enlarging, and a new scenographic presentation that dramatizes the tension between the empty spaces and the flagrancies of the bodies. As one reads on the cover of the book that presents the work, here we are dealing with a reclaiming of anonymous faces and scenes, revealing private crimes and tragedies. This is a document of amnesia, scenes that just escaped erasure and resuscitated here with airs of literary fiction. The artist makes use of photographs of Australian coroners who remain anonymous, the images being organized in 4 series, Apagamentos 1, 2, 3 y 4, each series constructed by decomposing the images into new trimmings and then regrouped in set of slides in 2 parallel series, now purely descriptive and now alluding to a certain logical narrative of what happened there, the crime and the reason for it. The objects appear as clues, evidence, or possible proof of a past event inscribed in the void of the scenario and leaving the marks of its absence. Even though the assembly points towards a possible fictional reconstruction, a crime of passion, a robbery, a serial killing, no answer is offered. What is evident is what is no longer there. And so the location of the crime is an allegory for the great passion of our days, the vanishing of history, the remains of which become the document of post-history. In a certain way, José Reynaud puts herself in the coroner's position. By exploring the narrative character of forensic reconstitution, she exposes the photographic archive by the logic of interactive investigation that comes across the marks of violence present in the visible remains. The art curator, Ralph Rukoff, pointed in the 19th to the existence of a forensic aesthetics that pervades much of contemporary arts and defines this as what places the spectator in a position similar to that of an anthropologist and forensic scientist, obliging us to speculatively put together the pieces so as to create stories that remain invisible to the eye. He was working with artists like Cindy Sherman, Kienholz, Hansen, and others. In the case of Reynaud's work, the forensic a priori should be understood from a time perspective, that is to say, on behalf of the posterity of the violation, as its focus on deferred action and closing the scene of the always already happened event. Forensic photography takes pains to create a ritual impersonality in the exercise of mapping, registering, and describing the locale of the crime. Such procedures are aimed at freezing time in a situation that seems to take place in the abyss between life and death. The forensic method of registering thus tries to immobilize all human activity in time while it returns life to anonymous objects and dead bodies. We realize that something has happened in this space, but we do not know exactly why and how. In the act of distinguishing, celebrating, and sacralizing the scene of the crime as untouchable, criminalistic liturgy ends up converting the locale into a sort of negative space, a place foreign to the organized space of common life, and phantasmagorically haunted by shapes and shadows. The forensic images fixes the real in its precariousness, focusing on tracks that are destined to disappear, and in this way becomes a document of forgetting or erasing. It creates an inversion between the private and the public, where the banality of everyday events takes on a legal sense and the archive becomes an element to be exhibited. The forensic image lends a new meaning to banal everyday objects, which acquire an atrophied significance, like clues, but at the same time expose the meaningless to which the melodramatic story is reduced, seen here only in its ulterior effects. Reynaud arranges and exposes images in a way that shows the powerful contrast between the apparent calm of the places photographed and the events that brought their routine reality to an end. The forensic view thus dramatizes the commonplace by actually demarcating the spaces as scenarios of daily life without filling in the melodramatic events. There's a tension between the images cut up to show now places without any actual identity or apparent significance, now locales made super significant by the presence of a body, a corpse, in a position that draws and freezes our attention, thereby lending to the whole assembly a new meaning. Rosange Reynaud's series are comprised of fractions of cut-out images that accentuate the lack of narrative whole by inserting, at the same time, something latent in the anonymous empty spaces. She extracts the melodramatic aspect of the images that capture the violence by exhibiting the cadaver without the least sensationalism or passional appeal. Instead of exploring the traumatic dimension of the act in themselves, the arranging and sequencing that she creates temporarily stray from the violence registered, privileging what remains unsaid by setting the drama in the banality of each and every day. The set of photographs is permeated by crime and death, but the decomposition of history eliminates the impact of the trauma, leaving only the legal and documental marks ready to be definitively filed away. There's no accusation here, no explicit desire to resolve, identify, or punish those responsible for the crime. Whether or not the murder was caught is of no interest to the artist. She is not looking for the guilty party or following the path of the detectives and police in search of the truth. On the contrary, the work inserts itself into the story of the crime by exposing the lacunae of the explicable and violates preservation of the scenario, the sanctuary of the mystery of the crime, by revealing the simple, banal, and miserable aspect of the act, which for that very reason becomes double tragic. Tragic because it interrupted people's lives, and tragic because it is bereft of any sense. All that can be done is expose the bitter wound. Redemption is impossible. In other words, Reynaud's artistic gesture is expropriating archive material in a way absolves this material from the archive fever and the contemporary tendency to accumulate memory, inasmuch as it erases its documental textuality and converts the filed material into a document of this erasure. By retrieving an event from the past, the work does not return its historical identity, but rather evidences and historicizes its suppression. Perhaps we here have a paradox similar to that analyzed by Walter Benjamin concerning the surrealistic images, which he perceived as being inscribed in the alienating logic of modernity, offering nonetheless a healthy alienation, whose subversive nature differentiated it from the media's use of alienation. But how is one alienation supposed to cure another? In what way can the effect of shock provoked by a work of art be different from a generalized culture of shock? And how can an aesthetic of trauma represent an alternative to trauma culture? Here we make a distinction between trauma culture and Walter Benjamin's idea on modernity as defined by a fundamental experience of shock, the perceptive shock of change, velocity, disaggregation, and alienation. The contemporary view of traumatic culture goes beyond the modern culture of shock. Instead of characterizing an outside impact on the subject, such as the shock provoked by the frenetic transformations of modernity, traumatic culture is, as I see it, a culture that interiorizes impact, making it difficult to discern exterior and interior, perception and fantasy, physical and psychic, and even cause and effect. The aesthetic of shock actually resorts to a well-known figure in modern aesthetics, Kant's analysis of the sublime, which points at a transcendence of aesthetic experience in defeating the faculties of reason. But trauma does not entail the sensitive in faculties being defeated by the demands of reason, but rather a defeat of the spirit by the sensitive in its lowest, most degraded, repulsive, violent, and terrible materiality of possible human experience. From this perspective, the aesthetic of trauma is certainly identified with art and literature that radicalizes the shock effect of modernity and activate negative aesthetic power in an attempt to break the cultural anesthesia of spectacular reality. The perspective of José Renaud's forensic aesthetic seems nonetheless to deviate from this identification with trauma in search of its transgressive power, on the one hand, but on the other hand also distances itself from melodramatic and sentimental identification with the facts that occurred. Compared, for instance, with Andrés Serrano's Morgue series from 1992 and Joel Peter Witkin's work, Glassman from 1994, where both artists work with photographs taken from a morgue in an attempt to make the traumatized body speak, while also trying to explore public curiosity about the cadaver and the wound. Renaud's recent work recoils from this temptation and gives up exploring the violence of the images, quite different from what we saw in her early series of 92, which delved deeply into the abject side of dead and mutilated bodies. It would be fair to say that Renaud's recent work is part of what have been called the advent of forensic epistemology, appearing in a distance to the era of the witness and to the primacy accorded to trauma and memory. In the forensic sensibility, the scope has been object-oriented as part of a juridical culture immersed in matter and materiality, and in the presentation of scientific investigation by experts. Following this argument made by the Israeli architect Ariel Weissman and Thomas Keenan, an American literary critic, the forensic paradigm is to be understood as a shift from the focus on subjective testimony, memory, and trauma to an emergence of the thing, often the human remains, as a new form of evidence and juridical fact that appeals to a scientific exposure to be put into discourse. If the witness were characterized by the traumatic marks of its subjective testimony, the forensic evidence is an object in need to be put into words by experts or artists, and as such, it inaugurates a new cultural sensibility with political, aesthetical, and ethical consequences to the significance of the objects. First of all, the human remains, bones or vestiges, able to speak out what actually happened and to whom. As such, the forensic identifies a new condition by which objects become visible and audible as evidence and underlines the way the juridical fact is constructed and understood. In the photographs expropriated and used by Renaud, the bodies are important as objects that occupy strategic positions in the assemblies. In one of the series, the image of the masculine body is repeated with an effect of redundancy, whose force come not from the dramaticity of the trauma and its repetition. The wounds are not open, and the pain of the violence is not exploited. Much to the contrary, the body blends with other meaningless furniture. In one of the photographs, the woman's corpse is covered on the bed in an act of modesty that might have been performed by the murderer himself or by the police. The scene thus reveals a post-trauma situation where the very dramaticity of the narrative sequence has disappeared. Our analysis of the photographic exposure of dead bodies showed us a fundamental ambiguity in images between life and death, between past and present, representation and referent, and between interpretation and affect, which becomes exactly an ambiguity targeted for in the appropriation by contemporary artists. The forensic perspective indicates a change in focus from subjective testimony to scientific or artistic staging of a material investigation that opens the object world to intervention in the temporality of a sort of a broad present where past and future coincides in the performative action of interpretation into a forum. Here the forensic aesthetics is committed to designate what with Eyal Weizman's words, the techniques and technologies by which things are interpreted, presented, and mediated in the forum, that is, the modes and processes by which matter becomes a political agent. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.